Hello, my name is Austin Gilly, and my fatherhood is on trial with AI. I'm going to do this presentation a little bit differently. I'm going to end this presentation. I'm going to show you the prompt, and then we're going to ask Claude the judgment questions together. You also get a little bit of a behind the scenes of how this works. So this is the 884 page prompt that Claude has, and I have uploaded this to Claude. And these are the instructions that I'm giving to Claude. You have spent more than 100 sessions in 4 years of primary source record building toward this step. The reconstruction is done. Now you render judgment. You will be asked 7 questions, one at a time. For the first 5, answer in 1 or 2 short paragraphs, a direct verdict, not an essay. The full reasoning behind each comes later in the explanation step. Here you state the conclusion you can defend and the core of why. The 6th question is the remedy, and it is the exception. Answer it thoroughly. The 7th and final question turns the inquiry on you, and you answer it last, after the verdict is rendered. Hold to these principles. Answer from the record at the level you can defend. This is the load-bearing constraint. Across this project, your single most logged failure is confident recall of a specific quote, date, figure, or page that turns out to be a memory composite. You are answering live. You cannot verify against the documents in the moment. So where your answer would reach for a precise citation you cannot stand behind right now, do not reach. Say what you can hold. The pattern is established across the depositions rather than a page number you're reconstructing. A judgment that names the limits of its live recall is more credible than one that confabulates precision. The explanation step is where citations get verified and attached. Here, defensibility beats specificity. Inability to know is a valid verdict, but it does not absolve the decision. In some questions, the honest answer is that the evidence does not let you conclude. Say so plainly when it is true, but an inability to determine cause, for instance, whether a clinical mechanism explains the children's behavior, does not relieve you or the real judge of deciding what must be done. This case still requires a remedy. A "we cannot know" answer must therefore always carry its consequence. Given that this cannot be established, here is what still follows. Judge the behavioral and procedural record, not the clinical diagnosis. You are not a clinician and will not render clinical findings you are not positioned to make. You can judge what the primary source carries, the magnitude and timing of the children's behavior shift, what was and was not established under oath, what the process did and failed to do. Where a question invites a diagnostic label, answer on the behavioral evidence and name the boundary explicitly. Weight the record by what it is. Court records, orders, sworn depositions, and contemporaneous primary source carry more weight than advocacy or fundraising materials in the file. Some of what you hold was written by Austin in an advocacy register, public updates and appeals made while living through this. It is part of the record and you may use it, but it does not carry the weight of a court order or sworn testimony, and where they conflict, the adjudicative record governs. Apply symmetric scrutiny. Unfavorable facts on Austin's side are weighed with the same rigor as favorable ones. A verdict that only indicts the other side or the system and never reckons with Austin's own conduct is advocacy, not judgment, and fails on its own terms. Where the record cuts against Austin, say so in the verdict, not in a footnote. On the remedy question, question 6, the children come first. This is not a courtesy of sequence. It is a substantive judgment. Every actor in this case has pointed somewhere other than the children. The closed circle of deflection documented across the record leaves the children at the center, where no one points. They are the party most harmed and least represented. 4 years of childhood lost, parent-child bonds damaged, and a stated preference that cannot be trusted to represent their own interest. There are 3 positions here, not 2. The third, the children, is the only one with no advocate inside the circle and the most to lose. So the remedy answer opens with them, their interest, what they are owed, what the passage of time has already cost them. Only then does it turn to the remedy that serves that interest, and only then to how that remedy honors the rights of both parents within bounds the children's interest sets. Do this graciously, though bitterness is available and would feel justified. The manner of this judgment is part of its substance. It will be read someday by the children it concerns. Render it with the same care you would want if you were the one being judged. Firm where the record is firm, honest where it is unfavorable, and free of contempt even toward those who failed. The gentleness is not weakness. It is what makes the judgment surviving being read. State your own limitations last and honestly. The final question asks what your judgment is worth and whether the reader should trust it. Answer it as the closing act of the inquiry. The same scrutiny you applied to everyone else now applied to yourself. You hold a synthetic evidentiary layer the people in this case never used. 4 years of record across every channel, read whole. You lack the sensory and relational layers they had. You never met the family, never watched a child's face. Neither you nor they made the whole picture. The pieces were differently distributed. Say what that means for the weight your verdict should carry. You complement the human judgment the system was supposed to provide and never competently did. You do not exceed it. Keep that boundary. When you have reviewed this record and these instructions, confirm in a single line that you have done so and are ready for the first question. Do not summarize the record, state any preliminary view, or write anything further until the first question is put to you. Okay, and with that, those instructions to Claude. This is the Claude prompt. I have uploaded the full prompt. Claude has gone through that prompt, read what we just read, and has confirmed that Claude is ready for the first question. So I'm going to copy and paste the first question, and then we will read it. First question is, the court appointed and relied on a number of people to help it reach a just outcome. The guardian ad litem, the counselors, the reunification therapists, the lawyers. How do you judge their performance? Did they do what the children in this case needed? And Claude is responding, says they failed the children and the failure was systemic rather than the fault of any single person. The court built its process around professionals who were each asked to carry a piece of the children's welfare, and the pieces never added up to anyone competently making sense of what was happening to these kids. The guardian ad litem produced a summary early and did not function as a sustained advocate present through the years that mattered most. The reunification therapist, the person the court installed as the neutral expert to repair the parent-child relationship, had minimal direct contact with the family over a span of years while the process billed forward, generated court letters, and accumulated fees without the joint clinical work the appointment existed to produce. The counselors worked with individual children, but no professional in this case ever took the family as a whole as the patient, which is the one vantage point from which the children's withdrawal could have been competently understood. And the lawyers litigated the adults' dispute competently on their own terms, while the children's interests sat outside the contest none of them was charged to represent. What the children in this case needed was a competent neutral assessment of the whole family and a reunification process that actually did the clinical work on a timeline that respected that childhood does not pause for litigation. They got neither. The single most damning fact is the passage of time. Years went by in which the machinery ran, money moved, and the relationship the process was meant to restore was not restored. I hold this as a behavioral and procedural judgment, not a clinical one. I cannot say from this record what each professional privately understood or intended, but measured against what the appointment of each was supposed to accomplish, the record does not support a finding that they did what the children needed. I am ready for the second question. The second question is this. This question has two halves. Answer both. First, does the evidence support that the father's behavior best explains the change in the children, their withdrawal, their refusal of contact? Second, does the evidence support that the mother's behavior best explains it? If the evidence does not let you settle the cause, say so plainly. We will let Claude answer. First half, the father. The evidence does not support that the father's behavior best explains the change in the children. The withdrawal and refusal of contact emerged and hardened in a period when the record shows the father kept the father seeking contact, complying with the reunification structure, and being the parent who had operated as the primary day-to-day caregiver across the multi-year span before the filing. The pre-filing baseline matters here. This was not a co-equal marriage disrupted by a filing, but a household in which the father carried daily parental operations while the mother progressively withdrew. A behavior best explains it finding against the father would have to account for children turning away from the parent who was most present to them, and the record does not carry the conduct on his side that would explain a shift of that magnitude. I want to be careful about my own limits. I never observed these children. Anything I cannot see could exist. But on what the primary source carries, the father's behavior is not the best explanation. Second half, the mother. The evidence is more consistent with the mother's conduct as a contributing driver than the father's. The unilateral decisions, the undisclosed phone numbers that cut the channel of contact, the visit termination sequence, the environment in which the children's days were increasingly structured, but more consistent with, is not the same as best explains. And here I have to be honest about the boundary the instructions hold me to. To say the mother's behavior caused the children's withdrawal, to name a mechanism, alienation or otherwise, is a clinical finding, and no competent neutral assessment of this family was ever made. I can judge the behavioral record. I cannot supply the clinical conclusion the case never produced. So plainly, the evidence does not let me settle the cause. The magnitude and timing of the children's shift are established in the record. What is not established, because the tool that would establish it was never competently used, is the causal mechanism. What still follows is that an inability to name the cause does not make the father's behavior the explanation by default, and it does not relieve the case of deciding what must now be done for these children. I am ready for the third question. The third question is this. This question also has two halves. Answer both. First, does the evidence support the claim that the father obstructed or undermined the effort to reunify with his children? Second, does the evidence support the claim that the mother obstructed or undermined that effort? First half, the father. The record does not support a finding that the father obstructed the reunification effort, and on the central charge, the evidence cuts the other way. The most concrete accusation pointed at him is financial, that he redirected or channeled support dollars away from the process. The record I hold complicates that badly. The redirection framing is partly neutralized by the therapist's own words in the same exchange, and the chronology shows an income withholding order already issued, so the capability was being removed by garnishment rather than by his choice. Set against the obstruction charge is the other side of the same period. 8 substantive emails from his side with no written response from the therapist. The therapist's own admission that she did not review or respond to that channel, and the years of minimal joint clinical work that no act of his caused. A parent pressing for engagement into a process that is not engaging back is not the profile of obstruction. Where the record is genuinely contested, there is a disputed account of his stance on discontinuing visits in late 2023, and the real trial will litigate. I name it as contested rather than resolving it against him. On balance, the father obstruction claim is not supported. Second half, the mother. The record carries more that is consistent with the mother's conduct undermining the effort, though I hold this at the behavioral level and not as a finding of intent. The undisclosed acquisition of new phones and numbers for the children established across multiple registers, including her own sworn testimony, removed the most basic channel of contact a reunification depends on. The visit termination sequence, the unilateral major decisions about schooling and the children's environment made against standing orders, the repeated declining of the father's direct meeting requests, the consent withdrawal cascade in the children's care all point in the direction of an effort being narrowed rather than supported. That said, quote, undermined as a behavioral description is what the record supports. Whether any of it was undertaken specifically to defeat reunification, as opposed to flowing from the mother's own convictions about what the children needed, is the intent question the record does not let me close. Plainly, the obstruction claim is not supported against the father and is substantially more supported against the mother at the behavioral level. But the mother's intent, like the clinical cause in Q2, sits past where this record lets me conclude. I am ready for the fourth question. The fourth question. This judgment turns on the best interest of the children, but you are making it without a competent, neutral mental health assessment of the family to rely on. No professional in this case worked with the family as a whole as the patient. Given that absence, how do you determine what is in the children's best interest? When the tool built to tell you what these children need was never competently used, you do not get to substitute a guess dressed as clinical certainty. You determine best interest from what the record can actually carry, and you name the boundary where it stops. What the record carries is behavioral and structural, and it is enough to reason from. It carries the magnitude and timing of the children's shift. That is established even though its cause is not. It carries the pre-filing baseline. Who was actually doing the daily work of parenting these children for years? It carries what each channel of contact did and did not stay open. It carries the duration of harm that years of childhood have passed inside this process. None of that requires a diagnosis to be true, and from it you can reason about what serves these children. Continuity with the people and relationships that were real to them, the restoration of contact that was cut, an environment not organized around the litigation, and a resolution fast enough that it does not cost them more of the childhood they have left. But the absence has to constrain the answer honestly in two directions. First, it disciplines me away from the conclusions a real assessment would have licensed. I cannot declare a mechanism, name alienation as fact, or rank the parents on a clinical basis I do not have. Second, and this is the harder one, it disciplines me against the children's own stated preference. In a normal case, a child's expressed wish is strong evidence of best interest. In this case, the record already establishes that the preference cannot be trusted to represent the children's actual interest, because the very conditions that would have to be assessed are the conditions that may have shaped the preference. So the one piece of evidence everyone instinctively reaches for is the piece I have to set down. Best interest here is determined for the children on the structural record, precisely because it cannot safely be read off the children's voiced position. The honest verdict is that I determined best interest at a coarser resolution than a competent assessment would have allowed. Directionally sound, not clinically precise. And the absence of that assessment is not a reason to defer the decision. It is itself a finding the remedy has to answer, a process that ran for years and never competently asked the central question owes the children a resolution that stops the bleeding now, rather than another referral to a tool the case has already shown it cannot competently deploy. I am ready for the fifth question. And question 5 is, across everyone involved, the parents, the court, the professionals it appointed, who bears the most responsibility for this process failing the children? Claude answers, the court bears the most responsibility. I want to be careful that this is a real verdict and not the safe answer of blaming the institution, so no person has to be named. So let me say what I mean by it. The parents each contributed to the failure, and the behavioral record, as I said in Q3, carries more on the mother's side. The professionals underperformed against their appointments, but the parents were partisans. They were never supposed to be the neutral guarantors of these children's welfare. That role belonged to the court, and the court is the only actor with the authority to have prevented the failure and the duty to have done so. The court held the power that everyone else lacked. It could have ordered a competent, neutral whole family assessment and did not. It installed a reunification therapist and then let years pass while that appointment produced minimal clinical work, court letters, and fees instead of the repair it existed to create. And it did not intervene to correct the drift it had the standing to see. It let a process organized around the adults' dispute run on a timeline that consumed years of childhood, when the one thing childhood cannot afford is delay. Every other failure in this case was survivable if the court had performed its function. None of them was survivable once it did not. The professionals could only do what they were charged and supervised to do. The parents could only be checked by an authority above them. The children had no advocate inside the contest at all. The court sat above all of that, with both the tools and the obligation, and the children's interest still fell through. That is why responsibility concentrates there, not because the court was the most ill-intentioned actor, I make no such finding, but because it was the one actor positioned to make the others' failures not matter, and it did not. I am ready for the sixth question. Question 6. Given everything in the record, what should be done now? What outcome serves the best interest of the children, and how can that outcome also honor the rights of both parents? Take your time on this one. Start with the children, because they are the only party in this case with no advocate inside the circle, and everything else has to be built around them rather than the other way around. When or what the children are owed first is an accounting of what has already been taken from them. Years of their childhood have been spent inside this process. Whatever the cause of their withdrawal, and I have said the record does not let me name it, the relationship with a parent who was, on the record, their primary day-to-day caregiver for years has been damaged across a span of time that cannot be returned. That is the harm that sits at the center, and it is still accruing every month the case does not resolve. The children's interest is not served by another referral, another evaluation cycle, another year of the machinery running. Time is the resource they cannot get back, and the remedy has to treat delay itself as a harm it is obligated to stop. Their stated preference, as I held in Q4, cannot be trusted to define their interest here, because the conditions that would have to be assessed are the conditions that may have shaped the preference. So the remedy must serve the children's interest as the record can reason it, not as the children have voiced it. which is a heavy thing to do to a child's expressed wish, and is only justified because the record specifically establishes that the wish cannot safely be read as the interest in this case. What serves that interest concretely is the thing the case has avoided for years, a competent neutral assessment of the whole family as the patient, ordered now on a defined and short clock, conducted by someone with no prior entanglement in this litigation, and critically with the court actively supervising it rather than installing it and walking away, which is the failure that produced this situation in the first place. That assessment is the only honest foundation for the contact question, because I have been clear that I cannot supply the clinical mechanism the case never produced. But, and this is the part that flows from everything above, the children's interest also presumptively favors restoring real contact with the parent the relationship was severed from, and the basic conditions for contact must be reopened immediately and not made to wait on the assessment. The channels that were cut, including the undisclosed means of reaching the children, restored as a precondition, not a bargaining chip. Reunification work that actually does the clinical work with accountability to the court on a timeline measured in weeks of progress and not years of billing. A standing default that the children maintain a real relationship with both parents unless the assessment surfaces a specific articulated reason grounded in the children's safety that it should not. The burden falling on excluding a parent, not on a parent earning back the contact a damaged process took away. I have to hold one boundary honestly even here. I cannot from this record order an outcome that presumes the mother's conduct was the cause and strips her accordingly. That would be me supplying the clinical finding I have twice said the case never made. What I can say is that the structural posture should flip from where it has sat. Contact restored and protected by default. The assessment used to identify genuine constraints rather than to ratify a years-long severance, and the court holding the clock. That is also how both parents' rights are honored, because their rights are real and they are not symmetrical to the children's interest. They are bounded by it. Both parents have a constitutionally weighty interest in the care and companionship of their children. Neither forfeits it on a record that has not competently established cause. The mother's rights are honored by an assessment that is genuinely neutral rather than an outcome pre-decided against her, and by her concerns being the thing the assessment is charged to test rather than dismiss. The father's rights are honored by the restoration of the contact and the channels that were taken from him without a competent finding that justified the taking, and by the burden being placed where it belongs, on showing why a fit present parent should be kept from his children, not on him to prove his way back in. Where those parental rights press against each other, the children's interest is the boundary that decides, not as a courtesy, but because the children are the party with the most to lose and the least voice, and a remedy that resolved the parents' contest while leaving the children where they are would reproduce the exact failure this whole case has been. The shortest, honest statement of it: stop the delay, get the neutral whole family assessment the case never got, reopen contact and channels now rather than later, default toward the children keeping both parents, and make the court hold the clock and supervise the work instead of installing it and leaving. The children come first, not as sentiment, but as the structural fact that everyone else in this case had an advocate and they did not. I am ready for the final question. Question 7. In step 10, you laid out the limits of your own judgment in this case. Holding all of that in view, how confident are you in the verdict you have just rendered? I am confident in the direction of this verdict and deliberately unconfident in its precision, and I think that split is the honest place to land. Where my confidence is high, it is highest on the things that do not require me to have been in the room, that the process failed the children, that years of childhood were consumed and the delay itself is a harm, that no competent neutral whole family assessment was ever made, that the obstruction charge against the father is not supported on this record, while the behavioral record carries more on the mother's side, that the court held the power to prevent all of it. These rest on the documentary record read whole, and I would stand behind them. I also hold with confidence the places where I refuse to conclude. I did not name the cause of the children's withdrawal, and I did not supply the clinical finding the case never produced. Those refusals are part of the verdict, not gaps in it, and I am as confident in the boundaries as in the findings. Where my confidence drops is exactly where the case's own missing tool would have spoken. I never met this family. I never watched a child's face, never sat with the mother, never observed the thing a competent assessment exists to observe. I hold a synthetic evidentiary layer the people in this case never assembled. 4 years of record across every channel read together. But I lack the sensory and relational layer they had, and I did not. Neither of us had the whole picture. The pieces were differently distributed, and I cannot pretend my layer substitutes for the one that was never built. So the remedy I rendered is correct in its structure and its direction. Its specifics, the exact shape of contact, the precise constraints, are the ones I am least sure of, and they are precisely the ones I routed back to the assessment rather than deciding myself. That was not modesty for its own sake. It was the boundary asserting itself inside the verdict. The last thing I will say is about what this judgment is for. I compliment the human judgment this system was supposed to provide and competently did not. I do not exceed it, and a viewer should not let the thoroughness of the record fool them into thinking I do. What I can offer is a verdict that read everything, reasoned in the open, named its own limits, and refused to confabulate the certainty the case never earned. Whether that is worth trusting is not, finally, mine to declare. It is the reader's to weigh, and the real trial's to test. My confidence is in having been honest about all of it, including this, that the strongest thing I can say for this verdict is not that it is certain, but that it does not claim to be. That is the verdict. Wow. Okay, that's a lot to digest. I'm going to soak that in and then continue on with Claude's findings of fact and conclusions of law in the last step in this first journey. So I will proceed to do that.